The clatter of the evening radio rattled against the thin walls of Evelyn Carter's kitchen, echoing through the small Ohio town like a distant storm. Her mother's hands paused mid-stir, and her father's fork hovered over the meatloaf, caught in the tension of the voice that seemed to crackle with urgency. Another convoy of soldiers has left for Europe today, more men needed at the front, the nation calls. The words weren't new, but tonight, they felt different. Tonight, they felt like a summons. Evelyn, 17 and restless, sat at the table with a notebook she hadn't opened in weeks. The headlines of war had always seemed distant, almost unreal, a story whispered in hushed tones at church, in the marketplace, in passing letters from relatives overseas. But now, with the radio spilling news of empty factories and recruitment drives, the war was knocking on her doorstep. She pushed the notebook aside and leaned forward. The thought had been lingering in her mind for months: what could she do when the men left? How could she help? And yet, a part of her feared the answer. Factories weren't for girls like her. Factories were loud, dangerous, and unforgiving. They were places of steel, fire, and smoke, not the quiet homes she had grown up in. But the pull was irresistible. By sunrise the next morning, Evelyn was walking past rows of shuttered stores and the sleepy faces of neighbors still brushing away dreams of sleep. Posters flapped in the wind, pinned to telephone poles, * women wanted. Join the war effort. Rosie the Riveter needs you. * She stared at the bold letters, feeling a strange sense of destiny tighten in her chest. Each step toward the factory felt heavier, yet more purposeful. The factory loomed ahead, a massive brick building whose windows gleamed in the early light. Smoke poured from the chimneys, curling upward like the fingers of some enormous mechanical giant, reaching for the sky. Inside, the air was already thick with heat and oil, the sounds of machines clanking, pistons pumping, and hammers striking metal forming a symphony that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Welcome," called a voice, startling her. She turned to see a woman in overalls, grease-streaked but smiling, her hair tied back in a practical bun. "First day?" Evelyn nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't worry," the woman said, clapping her on the shoulder. "We were all scared the first time. Stick with me, and you'll be fine. Name's Margaret." Margaret led her through the cavernous space, past rows of machines that hissed and churned with ceaseless energy. Women of every age, shape, and size were already at work, some bending over tables, assembling shells, while others maneuvered heavy presses that seemed impossible for human hands alone. Their faces were a mixture of concentration and determination, lips pressed tight or humming softly to themselves, arms moving with precision and speed. Evelyn's breath caught at the sight. She realized she was not just observing, she was becoming part of something monumental. Margaret guided her to a workstation near the assembly line. Evelyn's hands trembled as she touched the cold steel tools, the familiar world of home replaced with the clang and roar of industry. "You'll start with the smaller pieces," Margaret said. "Take your time. Watch the rhythm of the line. You'll get it." The first hours were a blur. Evelyn's hands fumbled, the metal cold and unyielding, each movement clumsy. Sparks flew from welding stations nearby, startling her, and she flinched at every loud clang, her heart hammering against her ribs. But slowly, she adapted. She watched the rhythm of the women around her, matching their pace, learning the subtle motions that made each task efficient and safe. Lunch came and went in a haze. She shared a bench with 3 other young women, sisters, cousins, and strangers brought together by circumstance. Names became familiar quickly: Alice, who laughed even when her hands were scraped; Nora, who spoke in clipped sentences but had eyes that softened when she smiled, and Lillian, who hummed songs from home as she worked. They were her new family, a patchwork sisterhood forged in steel and fire. By the end of the day, Evelyn's hands ached, her back throbbed, and her uniform was streaked with oil and grime. Yet she felt alive in a way she hadn't known. The work was hard, brutal even, but it was necessary. Each piece she touched, each bolt she tightened, was a contribution to something far greater than herself. She was no longer a spectator of war, she was a participant. That evening, walking home under the dim glow of street lamps, Evelyn reflected on the day. Her mother waited with a warm meal and tired eyes. "You look different," her mother said softly, studying her. Evelyn shrugged, unsure how to explain the mixture of fear and pride, exhaustion and exhilaration. I think I can do it," she finally admitted. Her father, silent until then, placed a hand on her shoulder. "The world's changing, Evelyn. You're part of it now. Don't ever forget that." Sleep came reluctantly. Dreams of machinery and fire danced with the memories of home, of quiet kitchens and familiar streets. In her dream, the factory hummed and roared, alive with purpose, and in the middle of it all stood Evelyn, determined and fearless, her hands moving with precision and strength she hadn't known she possessed. The next morning brought no rest, only a return to the rhythm of work. Evelyn entered the factory with a sense of resolve. Each day was a challenge, yet each day reaffirmed her place among these women who refused to be sidelined by circumstance or tradition. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, ordinary people performing extraordinary acts. And Evelyn was one of them now. The war was no longer a distant story on the radio. It was the sweat on her brow, the ache in her shoulders, the shared glances of solidarity when a machine misfired or a deadline loomed too close. The factory was her battlefield, and each day she survived, each day she contributed, was a victory. By the end of her first week, Evelyn no longer hesitated at the massive doors of the factory. She walked through them with her head held high, aware of the stakes, aware of the danger, and aware of the opportunity to prove herself. The world was demanding her courage, her strength, and her perseverance. She would answer the call. And in the heart of the factory, amid the clanging of metal and the rising smoke, Evelyn Carter became one of the Rosies, a young woman armed not with a rifle, but with determination, skill, and an unbreakable spirit. Hands of steel. The whistle blew sharp and sudden, slicing through the factory's morning haze. Evelyn wiped sweat from her brow and readied herself for another day. The rhythm of the machines was no longer alien, it had become a pulse she followed instinctively, each clang and hiss a note in a relentless symphony. Yet the work demanded more than rhythm, it required precision, courage, and unwavering focus. One slip, one careless move, and the consequences could be catastrophic. She began her shift at the press line, a massive contraption that molded sheets of steel into the frame of aircraft wings. Margaret had instructed her yesterday, "Respect the machine, or it will punish you." The words had seemed dramatic then, but Evelyn quickly learned their truth. The press roared like a living beast, jaws closing with terrifying force. Each piece she inserted needed exact alignment, each lever pulled with timing that left no room for error. By mid-morning, Evelyn felt the soreness creeping up her arms, yet she pushed through, driven by the thought of letters from the front, of soldiers who relied on the planes, tanks, and munitions crafted within these walls. She glanced across the floor and noticed Alice struggling with a rivet gun, her arms trembling. Evelyn dashed over, offering a steadying hand. "Here, try adjusting your grip," she suggested. Together, they managed to complete the assembly, sharing a small, victorious smile. The camaraderie among the women was immediate, unspoken yet profound. They shared jokes in hushed tones over the roar of machinery, passed sandwiches and tea during short breaks, and offered reassurance when a machine threatened to spill sparks across the floor. Evelyn felt a surge of admiration for them. Each woman had a story, a life interrupted by war, yet here they were determined, resourceful, and fearless in ways the world would rarely acknowledge. The dangers were constant. Evelyn learned quickly to respect the unpredictability of the factory. Sparks from welding torches could ignite oil-stained rags, presses could jam and slam without warning, and crates of heavy metal parts threatened to topple if mishandled. But with danger came skill, and with skill came confidence. By the end of her second week, Evelyn's hands moved with fluidity, rivets placed perfectly, levers pulled in sync with the conveyor, bolts tightened without hesitation. The machine's roar was no longer intimidating, it became a partner, responding to her touch, yielding to her control. Lunchtime brought moments of reflection. The women gathered in the break room, a small space crowded with benches and a faint aroma of oil and bread. Evelyn listened to their conversations, letters from husbands, brothers, fiancés overseas, fears about bombs falling on cities, dreams of post-war lives that seemed impossibly distant. Yet laughter often punctuated their talk, a defiance that refused to bow to the war. Evelyn realized that the sisterhood, forged in the heat of labor, was as vital as the work itself. It was support, comfort, and courage rolled into one, an unspoken lifeline that helped them survive the grueling days. By the third week, Evelyn faced her first true test. A misaligned part jammed the press, causing a violent kickback that sent a spray of sparks across the floor. Evelyn froze for a heartbeat, her mind racing. The women around her acted instinctively. One hit the emergency stop, another shielded nearby co-workers from flying metal, while Evelyn grabbed a tool to adjust the part. The press hissed, shuddered, and then fell silent. Heart pounding, she realized she had just prevented a disaster. Margaret appeared seconds later, her expression unreadable, before placing a firm hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Good work," she said simply. Evelyn exhaled, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a sense of competence she hadn't known she possessed. Days blurred into weeks. Evelyn's routine became an intricate dance of precision, speed, and awareness. She learned the quirks of each machine, memorized the timing of the conveyor belts, and developed an almost instinctual sense of danger. The physical strain was immense: blistered hands, aching shoulders, and fatigue that clung to her bones, but Evelyn welcomed it. Pain was proof that she was contributing, proof that she belonged. Yet the factory's relentless pace left little room for reflection. The women worked long shifts, 6 days a week, driven by deadlines, government contracts, and the invisible pressure of soldiers depending on their labor. Still, amid the clanging metal and hissing steam, small moments of humanity persisted. Alice hummed tunes from home, Nora drew sketches on scrap paper, and Lillian told stories from her childhood in London, painting vivid pictures of bombed streets and resilient communities. Evelyn soaked in these glimpses of other lives, feeling connected across continents and circumstances. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the smokestacks, Evelyn stayed behind to finish assembling a batch of airplane fuselages. The factory was quieter now, the din reduced to a low rumble. She paused, hands on her hips, and surveyed the row of completed frames. Pride swelled in her chest. These were not just pieces of metal, they were lifelines, vessels that would carry soldiers safely through the skies. Each one bore the imprint of her effort, her resolve, her growing confidence. Margaret approached silently, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Evelyn without a word, settling beside her. For a moment, they watched the machines hum in the fading light, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Evelyn realized that skill alone was not enough. It was courage, camaraderie, and determination that defined a true factory worker during these times. Each woman on the floor carried the weight of responsibility, and together, they transformed fear into productivity, chaos into order, and ordinary hands into instruments of war. As Evelyn walked home that night, the streets quiet under a blanket of stars, her uniform stained with oil and sweat, she felt a quiet transformation within herself. The girl who had hesitated at the factory doors only weeks ago had become someone else, someone capable, resilient, and proud. She had survived sparks and presses, the roar of steel and steam, and the constant pressure to perform. She had found her place among the women of the war effort, bound together not by blood, but by shared purpose. And as she entered her home, greeted by the familiar scent of supper and the gentle voices of her family, Evelyn understood that she had stepped into a world that demanded everything and gave back something immeasurable in return, the knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself, a network of women whose strength and skill would leave an indelible mark on history. In the quiet moments before sleep, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the machines, to the clatter of metal and the hiss of steam, to the laughter and camaraderie of her fellow workers. She traced the outlines of the day in her mind, feeling the ache in her muscles and the warmth of pride in her chest. The war was far from over, and the work would grow harder, more dangerous, and more demanding. But Evelyn Carter, once hesitant and unsure, had discovered her strength, and she knew she would meet every challenge with hands of steel. The price of fire. The morning air smelled of oil and metal, but today it carried something else, an unspoken tension. Evelyn sensed it the moment she stepped onto the factory floor. Conversations were hushed, movements cautious, eyes scanning machinery as if anticipating some hidden danger. She shrugged it off. At first, war had always carried a sense of urgency, and the factory was never forgiving. Yet, by the second hour, the atmosphere thickened with an almost electric unease. Evelyn had become adept at navigating the machinery. She moved along the assembly line with purpose, hands steady, eyes sharp. Sparks flew from welding torches and presses groaned in rhythm, but today, even the familiar symphony felt ominous. Margaret's sharp whistle echoed across the floor, signaling a malfunction on one of the presses. Evelyn froze for a split second, heart racing, then sprinted toward the sound. She found a co-worker pinned against the railing, eyes wide with shock, as smoke hissed from a jammed machine. "Step back. Everyone!" Margaret shouted, her voice cutting through panic. Evelyn grabbed a fire extinguisher, remembering the safety drills she had learned only days before. She sprayed the flames as sparks leapt around them, flames licking the metal frame of the press. For a moment, time slowed, every motion had to be precise, every breath measured. The danger was real, immediate, and unrelenting. The fire sputtered but did not die. Evelyn could feel the heat on her face, the sting of smoke in her eyes. Nearby, Alice's cry pierced the chaos. A tray of molten metal had spilled, narrowly missing a younger worker. Evelyn lunged, dragging the girl out of harm's way. In those terrifying moments, there was no thought of herself, only instinct, only action. The factory, once a place of rhythm and purpose, had transformed into a battlefield where every second counted. When the flames were finally contained, silence fell like a heavy blanket. The workers stood trembling, soot streaking their faces, clothes scorched in places. Evelyn sank to the floor, heart pounding, hands shaking. Margaret appeared beside her, her expression uncharacteristically soft. "You were brave," she said, gripping Evelyn's shoulder. Evelyn could barely speak. The reality of what could have happened, lives lost, limbs maimed, the factory reduced to rubble, pressed down on her chest. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Inspections, repairs, and emergency protocols replaced the usual rhythm of assembly. Evelyn's hands were scraped, her uniform smudged with soot, but she refused to leave her station. Every task she performed carried new weight, each rivet, bolt, and panel reminded her that their work could mean life or death for someone on the front lines. During the evening break, the women gathered in the corner of the factory, exhausted and shaken. Nora, usually stoic, clutched her arms around herself, trembling. Lillian, who often hummed while working, sat silently, staring at the floor. Evelyn realized that the fire had changed them, had changed her. They were no longer just workers, they were survivors, bonded by the brush with disaster. Margaret pulled Evelyn aside. "Listen," she said quietly, "today was a warning. This job, it will test you in ways you didn't expect. But remember, you are stronger than you think. Strength isn't just in your arms, it's in your mind, your courage, your heart. You've got all three." Evelyn nodded, absorbing the words, feeling a surge of determination mingled with fear. The factory demanded respect, and it demanded bravery, and she would need both in the days to come. The following week brought its own challenges. Equipment failures, supply shortages, and long hours pushed the women to the brink. Evelyn worked through fatigue, pushing herself harder than ever. She watched Alice struggle with repetitive strain, guiding her hands to prevent injury. She helped Nora steady heavy machinery, and Lillian lean into tasks with confidence despite trembling arms. Each act of support became essential. The factory had no room for mistakes, but it had room for solidarity, and that solidarity became a lifeline. One evening, as Evelyn cleaned her station, a sudden explosion rocked the far end of the factory. Smoke filled the air, and alarms blared. Workers screamed, running in all directions. Evelyn felt a surge of instinctive fear but forced herself to move with precision. She grabbed a fallen beam, using it to shield a younger worker who had tripped in the chaos. Flames leapt around them, metal twisted, and the smell of burning oil stung her lungs. Every second counted. Every motion could save or end a life. When the chaos subsided, the extent of the damage was revealed. Equipment destroyed, minor injuries across the floor, but miraculously no fatalities. Still, the emotional toll was immense. Women huddled in corners, silent tears streaking soot-stained faces. Evelyn sat against a wall, trembling, replaying every split second, every choice, every act of courage. She realized that this was no longer just a job, it was a test of resilience, of character, of the ability to face fear without flinching. Margaret came to her, a rare smile breaking through the grime. "You've earned your place here, Evelyn. Not just for skill, but for heart." Evelyn's chest swelled, not with pride, but with understanding. She now grasped the price of this work not only in sweat and fatigue, but in constant vigilance, courage under pressure, and a willingness to face danger every day. That night, as she walked home, Evelyn's hands still ached, her body sore from both physical exertion and adrenaline. She thought of the women she had helped, of sparks that had flown dangerously close, of machines that could kill as easily as they created. And yet, amidst the exhaustion and fear, a quiet determination grew. The factory had tested her, and she had survived. More than survived, she had acted, protected, and led when needed. In the days that followed, Evelyn carried the lessons of the fire with her. She moved with greater awareness, taught newer workers the safety protocols, and never underestimated the machines or the risks. Each act of preparation, each careful movement, became a shield against disaster. She began to see the factory not as a place of impersonal labor, but as a living organism, one that demanded respect, courage, and vigilance. Evelyn also realized the intangible toll, the weight of responsibility, the silent grief for co-workers who were injured, the shared anxiety in the eyes of women who had faced danger and survived. She found solace in the bond of sisterhood that had formed in the crucible of fire. Together, they endured, learned, and grew stronger. By the end of the month, Evelyn stood at her station, hands steady, eyes alert, heart resolute. She had faced the fire, both literal and figurative, and had emerged stronger, more capable, more determined than ever. The factory would continue to roar, machines would continue to hum, and the war would continue to demand their labor. But Evelyn knew that she and her sisters could meet it with courage, with skill, and with unbreakable resolve. The fire had taken their innocence, but it had given them strength. Evelyn Carter, once a hesitant girl unsure of her place, had become a woman forged in steel and flame, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The new dawn. The morning sunlight spilled over the factory rooftops like a golden promise. After years of relentless labor, alarms, and fires, a quiet sense of change hovered in the air. The war was nearing its end, whispers of victory circulating through the city streets and among the exhausted workers. Yet, the factory floor still hummed with activity, the machines clanging and whirring as if reluctant to let go of the rhythm they had maintained for so long. Evelyn entered with a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The routines that had defined her life, the shifts, the drills, the camaraderie born of hardship were beginning to shift. The factory would not close immediately, but the urgency of war production was waning. She noticed the faces around her, weary but proud, hardened by fire and fatigue, eyes reflecting both triumph and the anticipation of what lay beyond these walls. Margaret greeted her at the entrance. "Hard to believe it's almost over," she said, her tone lighter than Evelyn had heard in months. "Soon, we'll all be stepping out into a world that doesn't demand everything at once." Evelyn nodded, but a knot of uncertainty lingered in her stomach. The war had given her purpose, a clarity that life outside the factory might not offer. Would she feel as needed, as vital, when the machines no longer dictated her day? The morning passed with a different rhythm. Instead of frantic presses and sparks, the work focused on finishing final orders, repairing machinery, and cleaning the assembly lines. Evelyn moved through the tasks with a sense of reflection, her hands deftly handling tools she now wielded with instinctive skill. Each rivet, bolt, and panel reminded her of the months she had spent learning, struggling, and surviving. The physical strain was lighter, but the emotional weight was heavier, layered with pride, nostalgia, and uncertainty. During a short break, Evelyn stepped outside to watch the city beyond the factory walls. Smoke from distant bombed sites still lingered faintly, but construction cranes and rebuilding crews hinted at renewal. Children played in streets patched with cobblestones, their laughter a stark contrast to the sirens and explosions that had once filled the air. Evelyn realized that this was the world she had been fighting, working, and surviving for, a fragile yet hopeful landscape waiting for restoration. The women gathered in the break room, sharing news of loved ones returning from service, letters that had finally arrived, and tentative plans for the future. Alice spoke of studying engineering, inspired by the work she had done on the assembly lines. Nora mentioned wanting to open a small bakery, a dream nurtured despite years of destruction. Evelyn felt a surge of warmth, understanding that each woman carried ambitions previously sidelined by necessity. Their resilience extended beyond the factory. It would shape the post-war world. The final week of work was both somber and celebratory. The factory floor, once a cacophony of danger and labor, became a stage for reflection. Women moved in practiced synchrony, finishing last orders, cleaning machines, and logging inventories. Evelyn walked among them, noting the subtle changes, fewer fearful glances, lighter steps, and occasional smiles that had once been rare. Yet, beneath the surface, she sensed the residue of everything they had endured: the fires, the accidents, the pressure, and the unyielding expectation of perfection. On the last day, the factory doors opened wide, sunlight flooding the floor. Evelyn paused at her station, running her hands over the polished metal frames of aircraft and tanks they had completed. Each one bore silent testimony to months of sweat, courage, and unrelenting effort. Margaret approached, her face serious but with a glimmer of pride. "Take a moment," she said softly. "Look at what you've done. Remember it." Evelyn absorbed the enormity of the statement. They had created more than machines, they had crafted survival, hope, and a legacy. The women gathered for a final photograph, posed with grime-streaked faces and oil-stained uniforms. Cameras clicked, capturing the unspoken bond forged in adversity. Evelyn noticed subtle gestures, hands on shoulders, protective touches, small smiles that acknowledged shared fear and triumph. When the shutter closed, it felt like a seal, marking the end of a chapter that had demanded courage, sacrifice, and resilience. As she walked home that evening, Evelyn reflected on the transformation within herself. The factory had taken its toll physically and emotionally, but it had also given her strength, skill, and confidence. She thought of the fires she had faced, the machinery she had mastered, and the women who had become her surrogate family. She realized that war had reshaped her identity, instilling qualities she would carry into any future she chose. Returning to her neighborhood, Evelyn noticed the subtle changes in the community. Shops reopened, markets buzzed, and families reunited. Soldiers returned with medals and scars, their stories intertwining with those of civilians who had endured the home front. Evelyn felt a sense of belonging, no longer defined solely by the war but enriched by the experiences it had forced upon her. She knew that life would not be simple, but it was hers to shape, with the resilience honed in months of toil and danger. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn continued to grow. She enrolled in night classes to further her technical knowledge, inspired by the precision and problem-solving skills she had mastered in the factory. Alice and Nora joined community projects, sharing skills learned under pressure with younger generations. Evelyn realized that the lessons of the war, perseverance, courage, and collaboration, were not confined to the factory. They were tools for rebuilding, for shaping a world where women could claim roles once denied to them. One evening, Evelyn stood on the rooftop of her apartment building, looking out over the city bathed in golden light. The machinery of war was quiet, replaced by the subtle hum of recovery. She thought of the women who had worked beside her, each carrying her own story of sacrifice and triumph. Their shared experiences had created an unbreakable bond, one that would outlast the war and shape the post-war generation. Evelyn felt a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. Their labor had mattered, and their courage had left a mark on history. The final days of the chapter of war were not just about endings, they were about beginnings. The factory doors may have closed, but Evelyn and her sisters in arms carried forward lessons of resilience, solidarity, and courage.